Hello, 8th graders. My name is Mrs. Lockey, and today I'm going to model for you how to read an article with a purpose in mind, and then how to have a question in mind while you're reading, and then come up with a way to answer that question, and then revisit the text for the purpose of selecting relevant evidence that provides support or proves how you're going to answer that question. So this article should look familiar to you because it's the same article that you read for the informative writing pre-assessment. So I'm going to read the article, share my thinking, and basically I want you to pay attention to how I approach the article so that perhaps you could approach the article and use some of the strategies that I model the next time you read an informative article. Okay, so this article is titled Herd Behavior. It starts out with a definition of herd behavior. Herd behavior is a term used to describe the tendency of individuals to think and act as a group. And then there's headings in this article, so I know that the following two paragraphs below the heading background are going to provide me with background on what herd behavior is. The term herd behavior comes from the behavior of animals in herds, particularly when they are in a dangerous situation such as escaping a predator. All of the animals band closely together in a group and in panic mode move together as a unit. It is very unusual for a member of the herd to stray from the movement of the unit. So this paragraph defines herd behavior for animals, and then the term also applies to human behavior, and it usually describes large numbers of people acting the same way at the same time. It often has a connotation of irrationality, as people's actions are driven by emotion rather than by thinking through a situation. I'm going to slow down here. So connotation means, like, what does it mean for humans? And if something is irrational, it's not rational. So for humans, herd behavior means it's a irrational action driven by emotion rather than thinking through a situation. So it's almost like how humans react to a situation without really thinking it through. Human herd behavior can be observed at large-scale demonstrations, riots, strikes, religious gatherings, sports events, and outbreaks of mob violence. When herd behavior sets in, an individual person's judgment and opinion-forming process shut down as he or she automatically follows the group's movement and behavior. Okay, so this paragraph gives me background on what herd behavior looks like in humans. So it's similar to what it looks like in animals, but I think this is a key difference. When herd behavior sets in for humans, an individual person's judgment and opinion forming process shut down as he or she automatically follows the group's movement and behavior. Now for animals, I'm not sure, I don't think animals have the capability like humans do to have personal judgment and opinion forming process. Animals act more on instinct, but for humans, it is when individual people, the judgment and opinion forming process for humans shut down because humans automatically follow the group's movement and behavior. Okay, page 2 of the article. Okay, so we have examples of herd behavior is the heading. And so in this first paragraph, it's going to give one example. Herd behavior in humans is frequently observed at times of danger and panic. For example, a fire in a building often causes herd behavior, with people often suspending their individual reasoning and fleeing together in a pack. People in a crisis that requires escape will attempt to move faster than normal, copy the actions of others, interact physically with each other, and ignore alternative strategies in favor of following the mass escape trend. Okay, so in this paragraph, it focuses on how humans behave when they're in a situation of danger and panic, and the example given is how humans normally cluster together in a herd during a fire and kind of exit the building in a large group because everybody follows the group, even though in the situation of a real fire, it might actually be better to separate from the group. Okay, in this paragraph, it says, another commonly cited example of human behavior is the phenomenon of stock market bubbles. Large stock market trends often begin and end with a mass frenzy of buying, which are called bubbles, or selling, which is called crashes. Many observers see these stock market trends as examples of herding behavior because individuals are driven by emotion rather than reason to join the crowd. Greed drives mass buying frenzies, and fear drives crashes. So the second example also relates to a situation of danger and panic, but it's more panic. So people who have money in the stock market sometimes panic when there's a mass frenzy of buying or selling, and then they think they need to take action right away. And then this next section is about how humans behave in crowds. A more obvious example of human herd behavior occurs in dense public crowds or mobs. Crowds that gather because of a grievance or protest can involve herding behavior that becomes violent, especially if confronted by an opposing racial or ethnic group. The Los Angeles riots of 1992, New York draft riots, and Tulsa race riot are infamous examples of herding behavior that turned violent. Psychologists posit that a group mind can overtake a mob and embolden people to act in ways they would not individually, increasing the likelihood that situations become violent. So this example explains how one way humans behave in crowds is sometimes they become violent when everyone else is acting violently during a protest, for example, and it gives some examples of three different protests that became violent. Okay, the topic of this section is sporting events, so I expect that I'm going to see some examples of how what herd behavior looks like at sporting events. Sporting events can also create herd behavior on a violent scale. The football hooliganism prevalent in Europe in the 1980s is a well-known example of sports-related herding behavior and violence. Overzealous fans of football teams often engaged in unruly or destructive behavior in the name of supporting their team and intimidating the rival team, to the extent that people involved could be badly injured or even killed. So this example of crowd behavior explains how sometimes at sporting events fans can get overly excited in support of their team and act violently or be destructive in order to intimidate the other team. And so it's another example of how sometimes people become violent when in a large crowd, and this example is at a sporting event. This next paragraph takes an example from history. Some historians believe that Adolf Hitler purposely took advantage of herd behavior psychology by planting a significant number of undercover German officers in the crowds at his speeches. These officers would enthusiastically cheer for Hitler, and the rest of the crowd followed suit, making it seem as if the entire crowd supported Hitler. These speeches would then be broadcast to a larger public audience, magnifying the effect. So this example of crowd behavior shows how Adolf Hitler could influence a crowd because he purposely put German officers in the crowd to cheer for him, and then that encouraged the rest of the crowd to cheer for him, even if maybe the people in the crowd were not particularly in favor of what Hitler was saying. Okay, this last section is called Everyday Decision Making. Herd behavior does not always have such harmful effects. It can be influential in people's everyday simple decisions. For example, suppose that a family is walking down the street looking for a restaurant to have dinner. If they pass a restaurant that is empty and one that is relatively crowded with patrons, they are far more likely to choose the crowded one, on the assumption that it's better because there are more people there. Herding can be subtle in this way. It simply involves people's tendency to follow a crowd rather than carve out an individual path in many situations. So this last section points out how even everyday small decisions, such as choosing a restaurant, can be affected by herd behavior. And the example given is that if one restaurant seems more crowded than another, then many times people will assume it's a better restaurant and go to the restaurant that's crowded. Okay. So I retyped the question that I need to answer, and this is the question that you had for the informative writing pre-assessment. And based on Monday's lesson, before I even look for evidence, I need to figure out how I'm going to answer this question. So I need to restate the question as a topic sentence. So I'm going to type a topic sentence before I look for evidence. Herd behavior prevents people from stepping out of their comfort zone. And then I have to think about, like, how am I going to answer that? Why does herd behavior prevent people from stepping out of their comfort zone? And I'm going to go back through the article and kind of remind myself about some of the things I learned in this article. So the background information is not going to really help me answer why herd behavior prevents people from stepping outside of their comfort zone, because it's just background on what herd behavior is. But here, I think that the section of the article that includes examples could help me answer the question. So one thing I remember from this section is that in a situation of danger or panic, many humans then engage in herd behavior. And then there's several examples about how humans behave in crowds. And so what both of these examples have in common, the situation of danger and panic and then crowds, is that basically humans are strongly influenced by the people around them. Okay? So I'm going to be clear on how I'm going to answer the question before I search for relevant evidence, because I need to know how I'm answering the question in order to have evidence to support it. Herd behavior prevents people from stepping out of their comfort zone because humans are strongly influenced by the people around them. Okay, so I need to go back through the article and find examples of how humans are strongly influenced by people around them. Okay, so that's my focus for finding relevant evidence. So I'm going to go back to the example section. Okay, and I'm looking for relevant evidence. So in the section about the emergency or a fire, this piece I think would be relevant because it explains that when people are trying to escape a fire, they often follow the crowd. And then this example about the stock market, this part about how stock market trends end in a mass frenzy of buying or selling would prove how people behave in a crowd when it's a dangerous or panic situation. The stock market example really isn't a dangerous situation, but it would fit with a panic situation. Okay, and then for the examples of behavior in crowds, evidence that would be relevant to support how people are influenced by people around them. Like maybe this evidence I think is relevant because it proves that people act differently when in a crowd than how they would on their own. Okay, and then this sporting event example. Okay, so it just says, like, of course there's crowds at a sporting event. So sometimes people are going to, sports fans are going to sometimes overdo their support for their team to the point that it gets violent or destructive because they're following the group at the sporting event. And then I think this evidence right here would be a good example that would support how people are influenced by people around them, because it shows how when Hitler put some of his officers in the crowd and they cheered for Hitler, then it got everyone else around them to cheer. This last part, everyday decision making, this part right here about how they're kind of making their decision based on the crowd would fit. And that's all the time I have for today.